Before I begin, I should just, well, thank you very much for the invitation, and to all of you who have signed on. Thanks for coming. I very much look forward to someday in the future where we can have events like this in person and spend some time together, getting to know one another and kind of discussing all of these amazing research topics more informally and see where that leads to. But it's really great that you made it here today, so thank you for coming. The work that I'm presenting today was primarily performed by a former master's student, Bilal Abdel Wahab, who's moved on to a new job in the US. I'm giving the presentation today, and it was done kind of as part of this Exceed grant that you heard Matt and others talk about, which was, an internal grant to fund some collaboration between Amer's lab, the TAL, and the Saucy lab, to think about transit performance measures, human-centric measures, equity issues, as well as rethinking all of those things within the context of emerging mobility technologies and new technologies being integrated into traditional transportation systems. And this was a master's thesis that came out of that thinking, really about ride-hailing and trying to understand whether ride-hailing, what the equity implications are through an accessibility lens, and I'll get into that. So, just thinking about the last few years of buzz and maybe the death of buzz as well around ride-hailing, we know that it's received a lot of attention as a potential first last mile solution. We also know that it's received a lot of attention as a potential replacement for conventional transit, especially in lower density, lower demand transit systems like an on-demand transit system. And that even the Ontario government is asking local governments to consider ride-hailing and other microtransit solutions, consider offering those solutions in lieu of transit, and that it was mandated by the provincial government for agencies to look into these things if they wanted to receive COVID relief funding. So I think it was a timely topic 2 years ago when we started this, and it's remained quite timely, and I'm really pleased to be sharing the results with you today. But really, the big idea is we need to understand whether ride-hailing is offering accessibility benefits or user benefits over and above transit, who is likely to be able to reap those benefits, and how viable or feasible is this as a first and last mile solution. If you're wondering about this picture, don't ask what I had to type into Google to find this, but this is Uberman. It's an alternative Superman from an old SNL skit, and it's kind of questioning is, can ride-hailing companies really take on all of this promise that the buzz has been speaking about? The other kind of motivating side of this work is all around our work on justice and equity issues in transportation planning. And we really, most equity studies start with trying to compute or measure the benefits or costs of the transportation system. So in the previous presentation, we saw that the costs were kind of being measured as on-time performance metrics. And in Willem's presentation of the equity dashboard, we were really looking at accessibility as the measure of benefit of the transportation system. And across most equity studies written in the last few years, accessibility has really emerged as the main way to measure the benefits of the transportation system and to compare how those benefits are distributed into different population groups. Despite that emergence of accessibility being the key equity kind of the quantity that's being the way that we're measuring benefits. To our knowledge, there's not been many attempts of trying to understand how ride-hailing services like Uber and Lyft provide accessibility, or the degree to which they provide accessibility. And I think, my thinking on that is that to date, almost all transit accessibility measures are based on travel times. And of course, travel times associated with ride hailing are, going to be very similar to travel times associated with private cars. And it's, accessibility by ride hailing just based on travel times alone is always going to trump the accessibility provided by a public transportation system. And the issue here is that, of course, ride-hailing services offer quicker trips than transit in most cases, but they're also much more expensive. And we don't have a lot of accessibility tools that allow us to look at both fares and travel times at the same time. So actually, part of the innovation in the dashboard that Willem presented was having fare-sensitive accessibility scores just for the transit system. And in this research, we put forward, we didn't create our own methods, but we adopt a methodology that allows us to both consider travel times and costs, out-of-pocket costs at the same time for all modes. So a generalized cost formulation. So really our main questions here are: what levels of accessibility are provided by ride-hailing, and how does this compare to the levels of access provided by public transportation? We are looking at the viability, less so the viability, I would say more the accessibility benefits of using ride-hailing as a first mile solution. And we're also looking at the distribution of those benefits among different population groups. In the paper and the thesis, we get more into different population groups. For now, we're just looking at neighborhood improvement areas within the city of Toronto and looking at the accessibility benefits inside and outside of those pre-identified neighborhoods of concern. The method that we employed for our study is called the accessibility profile analysis. It was brought to my attention by a master's student's thesis out of Waterloo named Janelle Lee, working with Casello. And it's not their tool, it's something that they've kind of adopted from the early accessibility literature dating back to papers in the 1970s. And the general idea here is for each mode of transportation, we create a curve that represents the relationship between reachable activity destinations on the vertical axis and the generalized cost of travel on the horizontal axis. So rather than looking just at travel time versus reachable destinations, we're looking at generalized cost. And we have those costs for different modes. And we can use this profile analysis to visualize different levels of accessibility for different neighborhoods, for different modes, but we can also use it to quantify things as well. We can draw vertical lines on the plot and ask how much accessibility is provided for a certain fixed generalized cost of travel across different modes. We can also look at the area under these curves and divide it by the area, the total graph area, kind of like a Gini coefficient in that case. It's a percentage of, in an ideal world, if you can time travel, it's a percentage of accessibility obtainable by each mode of transportation. And one of the interesting things about this that we haven't done in this paper is we can trace out the maximum access profile across the three curves here in order to generate an accessibility profile that is truly multimodal. Assuming that an individual has the choice to travel by these different modes, we have a multimodal, a single metric now of multimodal accessibility for each neighborhood. Like I said, we didn't actually use that here, but it's an interesting feature of this tool if you're interested. So in order for us to compute our accessibility scores, we considered the generalized costs of travel by 3 modes of transportation and an integrated mode. So auto alone, walk, access, transit alone, ride hailing alone, and we have another mode that's an integrated ride hail transit mode, where ride hailing is used just as the access mode to rapid transit. So in order to generate our accessibility scores, we computed origin destination generalized cost matrices. Our source origins were all traffic analysis zones in the city of Toronto, and our destination matrices were all traffic analysis zones throughout the entire, I believe it was the GGH, the entire study area of the GTA model. On this graph, you're kind of seeing what, in gray, the components of the generalized costs that are based on travel times and routes coming out of the GTA model, and in yellow, the out-of-pocket costs that are added together with the travel time costs to create the full generalized costs. I want to stress that we did not do a lot of sensitivity analysis over the value of time. We thought it was very important, since this was a equity-focused investigation, to set a minimum wage value of time at $14 per hour, so that the benefits that we're calculating for people were most reflective of kind of low-income travelers in the Toronto area. Some of the results that we do have are sensitive to this value of time assumption that we made. So in general, the data for auto and transit travel times really all came out of the GTA model, hosted here at the University of Toronto. For ride hailing, we have an additional wait time for a ride hailing trip, and that was based on PTC data that we obtained from the City of Toronto. So it's a registry of 13 million ride-hailing trips within the City of Toronto, and we computed average wait times per neighborhood from that data set and applied those average wait times to each trip, to each origin, in the travel time matrix. We obtained neighborhood improvement area boundaries from the City of Toronto and employment counts from the TTS. Now, I just wanted to give you a bit of a schematic explaining how we assumed the integrated ride-hailing and rapid transit mode to work. For each origin destination pair, we first computed a matrix using ride-hailing from that origin to all rapid transit stations in the region, and another matrix of all rapid transit stations to the destination location using transit. So we searched through these matrices to find the best case generalized cost from origin to destination, right? Using a ride-hailing trip as the first access mode to rapid transit. If that generalized cost of the integrated mode was cheaper than the cost of that trip using transit alone, then we took that X to be the generalized cost of the integrated mode for that OD pair. But for many, many, many origin destination combinations, it was actually more expensive to use ride hailing as that first mode, right? More expensive in terms of generalized cost. So even after accounting for the travel time savings. And in that case, we reverted back to the transit generalized cost for that OD pair. So in this sense, the integrated mode is seen as a premium added on to, right, to the baseline transit accessibility that already exists in the system. And if it improves the travel costs, then we take advantage of that integration. And if a trip isn't served well by integration, then we ignore it and just revert back to transit. This is what some examples of those APA profiles look like for different, aggregated up to different planning districts in the Toronto area. And there's a few really, really interesting things here. Let me start with the bullets and then point you to different areas in the plot. So the first thing is that the integration that we modeled provides very little benefit over transit alone. In fact, when we look at the raw OD matrices, we find that integration only results in a lower generalized cost for 7% of all OD pairs in the region. And in the plots, this is evident in the overlapping between the red line for the integrated mode and the green dotted line for transit alone, right? So integration is slightly higher, but really just within a couple of percentage points higher than transit alone on average. And that was true more or less for all areas of the city. In terms of the other kind of really fascinating thing that we found is how similar the accessibility scores are here between public transit and ride hailing alone. So if we compute just the, this is no longer the integrated mode, but if we just assume people were using ride hailing alone for their daily trips, the accessibility scores for ride hailing usually start off a bit better than transit at the lower, in the first half of the cost dimension. And then there's a switch, and for longer trips, transit tends to provide more accessibility than ride hailing. We can ask about how the costs are set, the fares are set for ride hailing, but it seems to me more than coincidental that the accessibility scores, for ride hailing, after trading off travel time benefits and out-of-pocket costs, really ends up in a very, very similar, close ball within a few percentage points of the accessibility curves for transit alone. So a lot of competition in that space, probably being designed into the system by how ride-hailing companies are setting their fares. The other last point that I want to really raise is it's a horrible plot for this presentation, I'm realizing, but on the top right, the dashed lines are for the average accessibility profiles within the neighborhood improvement areas. The solid lines are everywhere else, and essentially accessibility is lower in the NIAs compared to other areas in general, and that shouldn't be a big surprise. Okay, let me keep moving along here. So how do we compare the ride-hailing accessibility scores to the transit accessibility scores? This table is just showing you kind of the percentage difference between the access score obtained from ride-hailing versus the access score for transit alone. And again, this is ride-hailing alone, not integrated. So what do we find? Oh, and then we've done this for two different generalized costs. Remember I talked about setting a vertical line. So for local trips, we're setting a vertical line at $26 of generalized cost. And for regional trips, it was at $50 of generalized cost for the trip. Okay, so that's time plus money. So within PD1, which is downtown Toronto, we see really low accessibility premiums associated with ride sharing versus transit. In the inner planning districts, that starts to increase, but it's really out in the border planning districts around the edge of the city of Toronto that we see the biggest benefit associated with ride sharing. Within NIAs, we see that ride sharing is benefiting, has a greater benefit within NIAs than compared to outside of NIAs. So within NIAs, ride sharing is delivering about 60% more accessibility than transit, but in general, in the city, the average is only 30%. And that really has to do with where the NIAs are within these planning districts. The next map shows you that the NIAs in green, okay, the green boundaries are really out in the suburbs of the city, and that's where we do see slightly more benefits associated with ride hailing. Now, these maps are showing the ride hailing benefits at the TAZ level, so lower, spatial resolution or higher resolution than those planning districts, and we see that for some TAZs, the benefits like even of ride hailing are like 5 times that of public transit. And specifically out here in the western area of Toronto, we see a big benefit, and we're really attributing that to access to employment lands at the airport and potentially elsewhere outside of the city of Toronto, where transit connectivity is both expensive and services aren't as integrated as they could be because of the municipal boundaries. And therefore, access to jobs via transit is actually really, really poor, but ride hailing does a pretty good job of getting people across those municipal boundaries into those job centers, in the airport over here, without having to pay the double transit fare. If we look at the integrated mode, and I'm looking at the time and I'm gonna just go, I think I only have a couple more slides. If we look at the integrated mode, we see that there's very little benefit of integration everywhere. This is under the assumption that the traveler bears the full price of the Uber trip, or sorry, of the ride hailing trip to the first rapid transit station. We see that the highest benefits are experienced in this ring around the subway lines, so not adjacent to the subway lines, where walking access is still, provides a lower generalized cost, and not a really long distance bus trip. So Uber isn't that competitive against a long distance bus trip to transit. It's these short trips, like 5 kilometers, where you can really save quite a bit of time at a low cost in order to get to transit via a ride hailing trip. In general, we are not seeing a lot of benefits within NIAs. So people thinking about using ride hailing in tower communities, right, low-income tower communities to reach public transit, not a lot of accessibility benefits associated with that, especially if we are asking people to pay that cost of accessing rail. So ride hailing provides a higher job accessibility in peripheral TAZs, especially those near cross-border employment districts. And in thinking about a policy implication, I really do think that we should be exploring ride hailing as a stopgap in the absence of service and fare integration. So while we're going through this decades-long process of fare integration in our region, ride hailing really can be utilized, I think, to quite efficiently get people to cross-border destinations. The other thing that we found is that ride hailing was really most beneficial for shorter distance trips and less beneficial for longer distance trips. So the way the prices are come out of the wash there. And for me, that's quite a dangerous thing. If there's a natural kind of benefit associated with short distance trips, we might see a lot of competition arising between ride hailing and more sustainable modes like bike sharing or e-bike sharing. And I think it's really important that when we look at kind of micromobility alternatives or augmentations to our transit system, we don't want to get into a system that's really results in having more cars on the road for local trips under a few kilometers long that can be easily done by bike sharing. So it's really important that we remain vigilant there from a sustainability perspective. If we want integration to work, it's going to require significant subsidies, especially for low-income riders. It's my very last slide, Amar. I see you coming online. So future research really needs to look at exploring the subsidy size and also taking an operational perspective. I know that most of the people here are operators. But we haven't looked at the subsidy associated with those feeder bus routes on the TTC. I don't think the subsidy on those routes per trip is as high most of the time as a subsidy for a ride hail, but we need to do some of that work. And if we are thinking about where the real benefits are, ride hailing alone, getting people all the way to their destinations via ride hailing, could be especially attractive as a social equity intervention, based on the fact that a lot of neighborhood improvement areas have poor levels of access by transit, and that's really where we can be focusing some assistance in helping people get to important destinations by car via ride-hailing solutions. But in the meantime, I think we have to be careful with these generalized cost formulations, because they kind of ignore affordability, and find the generalized cost of transit and ride hailing might be similar, but the out-of-pocket costs really remains a major barrier for low-income people, and that's where subsidies again become really, really important. So with that, I just want to acknowledge funding from our Exceed grant and my collaborators who have already mentioned today, and thanks very much for your time.
Thank you so much, Steve. It's definitely